Welcome to Global Perspectives. What is life like inside the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Kurdish military? For answers, we turn to General Ernest Audino.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, General Audino.
Thanks, John. Thanks for asking.
Thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved with the Kurdish Peshmerga and embedded with them.
Right. So in '02, I was a student at the U.S. National War College when we had a class of 200 plus students from the military and other agencies and other allied countries. And I chose to concentrate in Islam in the Middle East. And one of my professors was Ambassador Peter Galbraith, a longtime friend of the Kurds. And it was under Peter Galbraith that I was inspired to develop, and he encouraged me to develop a more refined concentration on Kurdish history, Kurdish culture, Kurdish issues. And lo and behold, 4 years later, the Army embeds me with the Kurdish fighters in Iraq, and that really was the most significant assignment of my career.
So tell us what that was like, because you're going from one military culture to another, and this is an organization that not too many people know about, relatively speaking, more so now than a decade ago, but one of the most celebrated and appreciated military organizations around in terms of capability and bravery and so forth.
You know, teams like mine that were embedded with indigenous forces, and there was about a 2-month ramp up, 2-month train up, and involved all kinds of things. Of course, some required reading. One was a Special Forces manual, U.S. Special Forces manual on combat advisors, combat advising. And it was a pretty thick document, but in there was a foundational principle for effective advising. And I thought when I read it that this is very important, and in hindsight it turned out it really, really was. And the principle was this, that an effective combat advisor must develop rapport with the indigenous comrades. And I believe that my academic preparation on Kurdish issues helped me develop that rapport. And I was able to understand what motivated them, what historical developments they thought were priorities or were important. Knowing what was important to them was very important. And that brought us closer together, but I'm going to quote a 13th century Persian poet, Saadi from Shiraz. The Iranians claim he's Persian, the Kurds believe he's Kurdish, but he said, joint interests make for the best of allies. And Mustafa Barzani used to quote him as well. The point of this is the embedded advisor must be able to think like the indigenous comrades, because that advisor has to be perceptive enough to identify where there are joint interests between the United States and the locals, because then you can move mountains. And it is relatively simple and easy to train, equip, and advise a indigenous unit to, let's say, defend a central regime. But changing what they think is important, no, that's another matter. That's very difficult.
How much language training did you have as part of this?
Well, we had it was not much, John. We had it periodically throughout that 2-month preparation period, and strangely enough, because of a military snafu, we still thought during that ramp up we weren't going to the Kurds. That wasn't even on the table. We thought we were going to Baghdad, and we had been reading, studying Arabic. And it wasn't until I got to Kuwait with my team as one of the last steps before going into Iraq that we were able to confirm our final destination. And when we found out it was Kurdistan, I told my guys, hey, you just won the lottery. And then I picked up the phone, I called back to the Defense Language Institute, and I said, hey, here's my problem. And I explained it to him. Do you have anything in Sorani, which is a dialect of Kurdish? And the lady I spoke to happened to be Kurdish. And she said, well, yeah, I have a bootleg copy of a Sorani. I'm not done with it. I can send it to you. And that's when we established a crash course in Kurdish.
And a lot of the Kurds speak some English, so that
Yeah.
probably helped quite a bit.
Right. And then, of course, we had a robust complement of linguists. They lived with us, and those who wanted to carry weapons, we allowed them to carry weapons as well. They're all Kurdish. We had one Assyrian, but they were as trusted members of the team as any American.
So what is the mystique of the Kurdish fighter? Why does the Kurdish fighter have that reputation? This is someone who obviously is there defending the culture and the people above all else, and it's a different type of commitment than you have in a lot of places.
Right. So I think there are two aspects to the answer to that question. One gets to their tenacity, their refusal to submit. But the other gets to their identity as Kurds, and they take you in two different directions. And I'll tackle the first one first, tenacity, this refusal to submit. Xenophon, in his Anabasis, the Persian expedition, wrote when he took the 10,000 to Persia, he had to cross through Kurdistan, and I think he crossed through portions of where I happen to be. He wrote that he lost more men in a week fighting through the Kurds than in 2 months fighting the Persians. And these were the mountain tribes. And even the king of Uruk, in probably well before the birth of Christ, called them the stinging serpents of the hills because he couldn't subdue them. There has been no regime ever since that really was able to fully subdue the tribes up in the mountains along Mesopotamia, the Zagros Mountains, Taurus Mountains. Anyway, so that's tenacity, but the other part is identity. The Kurds overwhelmingly identify by blood, which is an anomaly in the Middle East, where everybody else identifies first by their religion. The Kurds identify first by their blood. This is an absolute anomaly over there. And consequently, they're Kurdish first. All else, including Islam, is second, including religion is second. And that has generated a safe haven for many different religions. There are Kurdish Christians, Kurdish Jews, pre-Christian religions, the Yazidis, the Kakai, as well as Muslim, and Kurds are probably 97% Sunni now.
So how does all of that work out in terms of the battlefield? So if you have this identity, you have this unwillingness to quit, does that result in more heroism? Does it result in, I guess, a willingness to take whatever steps are necessary, even if it means dying in the process?
It is about will. I've said for a long time, I'd rather take a unit with will over a unit with ability any day of the week, because I can deal with the ability. Generating the will to fight, this is a different matter. I'm going to add a little bit of something to your question, and it's not just the tenacity and the identity, but it's also there's an experience and a modern experience that has also shaped this Kurdish will to prevail against oppression. It's their history of genocide. They have been the target of genocide and great repression in Turkey, 20 million Kurds in southeastern Turkey. But in Iraq, the 7 million or 8 million that are there, we know what Saddam Hussein did to them, but it goes way back beyond that to Ottoman repression. In 1909, when Sheikh Mahmud's father was assassinated up in Mosul, the Sheikh Mahmud's rebellion itself, and it has just continued all the way through the chemical attacks of the Baathists in the 80s, the Anfal, which the Anfal operation that Saddam Hussein launched against the Kurds. That was his final solution. He had enough of the Kurds. 1987, 88, thereabouts, he launched that, and the result is 7 million landmines were sown into Kurdish soil. These were prohibited zones where no living creature, certainly no Kurds, were allowed to stay. 7 million landmines, 5,000 Kurdish villages systematically destroyed, surrounded by military, bombed into rubble, and of course, as the people, the villagers ran out, they were captured and moved into concentration camps. There were probably a half dozen former concentration camps within a 30-minute drive of my safe house in Kurdistan. And then the chemical attacks. At least 48 Kurdish villages, at least. And Halabja, of course, was the biggest. And we've just passed the anniversary of Halabja, March 16th. That was 1988. 5,000 villagers died. And those were nerve agents like VX, an absolutely sinister weapon. Blister agents, probably choking agents. And I got to Halabja many times. It was probably 25 minutes from where I was headquartered, my safe house. So what does that tell you? I'll just put it in the words of some of my Kurdish friends. They said that they faced this evil and they are determined never to go back to it. Never. So that experience, that tenacity, and that identity combines in today's Kurds, and they've become great allies of the United States and the West, consequently, and they're defending humanity.
Well, you're a career military person with all kinds of experience, and yet I'm sure there was something you learned from being embedded with the Kurds, especially for a year. If you had gone in for just a short period of time, maybe not so much, but after a year, what did you learn? What did you come away with in terms of the experience?
That's a very good question. I think I learned to appreciate each day much more than ever before. You know, we grow up in the United States blessed that our life is almost guaranteed. We've pretty much got a guaranteed life. Not so over there. And I watched my Kurdish friends strive every day to make today better than yesterday and tomorrow better than today. I watched them raise themselves up from the ashes of genocide to build. While I was there, first, it is the most beautiful part of Iraq. It's up in the mountains. It's lush. It's green. The people they love democracy, free speech. Nothing's perfect, but they're trying, right? They're moving in those directions. The most beautiful, the most peaceful. No American has died at enemy hand on Kurdish soil ever. Isn't that something? And the most prosperous, although world oil prices now, and Baghdad's cutting off of the constitutionally required 17% of the federal budget to the Kurdish regional government. Baghdad has cut that off completely, refuses to honor that part of the Iraqi constitution. All of that has combined to cause an economic crisis. Well, plus the cost of fighting the war against ISIS and the cost of housing and safeguarding. Probably over 2 million refugees now of all ethnicities and religions. They flee to the Kurdish region. Nobody flees to Baghdad, John. That should tell you something. So I've watched the Kurds do this great commitment to move past the past and appreciate every day as if it's a gift. And it's given me a new perspective on a lot of things.
Now, you recently had the opportunity to go back and rejoin your comrades in Kurdistan that you had served with over a decade ago. What was that experience like?
Yeah, really remarkable. I hadn't seen these comrades of mine in 10 years, so I linked up with so many of them. And yeah, there's a great deal of love there between all of us. But the first reason why I was there was I was invited to a conference sponsored by Saran University on terror threats and the example of coexistence in Kurdistan. It's a great concept for the conference because when you look at the extent of jihadi ideology, let's just track the black flag of ISIS. That physically extends all throughout the Sunni areas. ISIS itself is Sunni. All through the Sunni areas, but it stops at the edges of Kurdish-controlled soil. The Kurds are 97% Sunni. So there's a lesson in there if we can understand it somewhere in there. So that conference explored that, very well attended. I was there, had a chance to meet General Barzani while I was there, who commands the Black Tigers, a very high priority unit in the fight right now. Then from there, I got invited out to Duhok for a conference on Kurdish independence, the first of its type, and this process is moving steadily in that direction. Very well attended conference. Had a chance to meet the Kurdish Prime Minister Necirvan Barzani and the Kurdish Chancellor Masroor Barzani, and many, many others. Peter Galbraith was there too, by the way. So then from there, then I went out to Saran, out towards Rawanduz, where I met a wonderful man. He earned the title the Lion of Handreen in 1966. He was one of Mustafa Barzani's most trusted battlefield commanders. And when the Iraqi government decided they had enough of the Kurds up north, they sent a division, a brigade, an army brigade north to crush these Kurds. And Mam Itzit, who commanded a few hundred Peshmerga, waited until this brigade had moved into a valley, and then they launched, and they decimated an entire Iraqi brigade. The defeat was so humiliating that Baghdad moved towards the 12-point, or the peace process after that. But anyway, I had a chance to meet this wonderful gentleman. And from there, then I linked up with some of my commanders in Rania. Then we went down to Sulaimani and spent a night down there. Sheikh Jafar, former minister of Peshmerga, spent some time with him. Mustafa Chowrush, another high-level Kurd who was also the victim of an assassination attempt by Saddam Hussein, poisoned, by the way. His mother died practically in his arms back in 1988. Mustafa Said Qadir, former minister of Peshmerga, and lots of line-level Peshmerga and old friends, and some of my old interpreters are still there.
So you had lots of stories to share,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking in the early months of the struggle against ISIS, the Kurds were at a big disadvantage because ISIS had superior military equipment and everything else, and yet they held on and they were successful in many of the battles. Why? What was it? Does this go back to the commitment and the will and all of that you were talking about? They were just fighting against significant odds.
Right. So the initial ISIS advance took a lot of people by surprise, when the Iraqi army ran away, they did. When they ran away, the Peshmerga stepped forward, and hence Kirkuk now hasn't been overrun by ISIS, as Mosul had, even though they're not too far apart. Had the Peshmerga not stepped forward, Kirkuk could very well have fallen. And we should all be thankful for that. Even Baghdad should be thankful for that. And the Kurds rapidly established a border with ISIS-controlled soil of 600 miles long, and they continued to expand. Now, they had a setback at Sinjar, which is way out on the frontier near the Syrian border. Yes, the Peshmerga units that were there, and they weren't very well equipped at the time. They withdrew, and then we had the slaughter on Sinjar of the Yazidis. The Kurds have since gone back. The Peshmerga and others, the other Kurdish forces, have gone back and cleaned that place up. So that's back in Kurdish hands. And so the Kurds have been maintaining this soil and clearing hundreds of square kilometers since then, including they isolated Mosul for a year. They had the control of soil on the east, north, the east, north, and west of Mosul. They weren't going to go into Mosul because they really don't consider that that they have any claims on Mosul. That's the matter for the Iraqi army. They isolated the city, waiting for the Iraqi army to get ready to do this, to summon the courage and the ability to come back. And they've been holding that ever since. And so now we know, what's happening with Mosul.
You mentioned the independence issue. How critical will the Peshmerga be if independence is the path that's taken?
Well, absolutely critical. I mean, every sovereign country needs a security force. You've got to be able to defend your borders, and the Kurds are preparing to do that. But I want to make one thing clear. Although the KRG and President Barzani in particular have publicly announced that they're moving towards a referendum. They're going to ask the Kurds, okay, what do you want? Do you want to remain in Iraq, or do you want to become a sovereign state? Whether or not Kurdistan and Iraq becomes a separate sovereign country has less to do with that and more to do with the fact that the rest of Iraq is leaving Kurdistan, not Kurdistan leaving Iraq. And if we look at the functions of government, the rest of Iraq is having some great difficulties, and we've got a stronger or a developing Kurdistan moving in the right direction while Iraq is becoming rapidly annexed by Iranian forces. So the southern 60% of Iraq is fundamentally, functionally controlled by Tehran. The Iraqi army is at least 80% Shia, the co-religionists to the Iranians, and influenced and supported by Iranian elements. And then there are the Shia militias. So in 2014, Grand Ayatollah Sistani issued a fatwa authorizing the raising of a Shia army outside of the Iraqi army, inside Iraq. That's 110,000 Shia militiamen now who are pushing their way north with the Iraqi army. So Iran is very deliberately establishing a footprint in there. It must control the Kurdish soil as a land bridge into Syria to project Kurdish, Iranian power all the way to the Mediterranean along the Shia crescent. So this is what's happening now. The rest of Iraq is rapidly becoming Iran.
You were talking about freedom of speech, budding democracy, and so forth. You've also got a growing market economy in Kurdistan. You've got, as you said, a lot of appreciation for other cultures and languages. Many of the universities, the new universities in Kurdistan, have English only in the classroom. How is all of that helping to advance the Kurdish presence and encourage this direction toward independence? Yeah,
they're exhibiting values and principles very similar to what we hold important in the West. To me, it indicates a path, a Western path for their future versus an Eastern path. And I think that's quite significant. If you were to go to the Kurdish area today, you would see a great appreciation for Western curricula, liberalized curricula in schools, a great admiration for art. There are plenty of art galleries in the Kurdish north of Iraq. Who builds art galleries elsewhere in that region, right? Playgrounds, soccer fields, plays, movies, poetry, housing developments, shopping malls. It's moving in the right direction, John. So when we talk about joint interests, those things are important in foreign affairs and domestic affairs.
We're about out of time, but if you had one word to describe your experience with the Peshmerga, what would it be?
Irreplaceable.
So definitely one of the best experiences of your military life and your life overall.
Yeah, it's shaped the second half of my life.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, General Audino. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks, John. Thank you.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.